Madam President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I come to the floor today to talk about the damage Obamacare is doing to the struggling economy. Now, after months of unrelenting coverage of Obamacare's many problems and after Friday's release of December's dismal jobs report, I'm sure Democrats here in the Senate would prefer that we talk about almost anything else. After all, when you've held most of power in Washington here for the last 5 years, you don't want to mention the fact that your main legacy is a sluggish economy and a disastrous train wreck of a health care program. This past Friday, we found out that December marked the weakest month of job growth since January of 2011. The economy added just 74,000 jobs in December, less than half of the monthly job growth needed for a real recovery. Now, some are saying that perhaps this is an aberration, and perhaps it was for a one-month period. But the one thing, Madam President, you can't get away from is that December's drop in the unemployment rate, the slight drop that we saw as a percentage, was driven by nearly 350,000 Americans dropping out of the workforce altogether, driving the labor participation rate to its lowest level in 36 years. We haven't seen a labor participation rate this low literally since the Carter administration. Had millions of Americans not stopped looking for work since January of 2009, the unemployment rate would be a staggering 10.8%. And what I mean by that, Madam President, is if the labor participation rate were today what it was in 2009, in other words, the number of Americans actually in the labor force out there looking for jobs, the unemployment rate would be almost 11%. Significantly higher than what we use as the official unemployment rate today. Even without that, the Wall Street Journal points out that, and I quote, the unemployment rate remains near levels previously seen only during recessions. Now let me repeat that. The Wall Street Journal states, and I quote, the unemployment rate remains near levels previously seen only during recessions, end quote. Now that's a pretty damning statement. The President and his advisors would like us to believe that President Obama's policies are growing our economy and putting Americans back to work. But in the 5 years of his presidency, all Democrats have been able to accomplish is a recovery that looks a lot like other presidents' recessions. In his weekly address on Saturday, the President said he would do, and I quote, everything I can to create new jobs and new opportunities for American families, end quote. And how does he propose to do that? By treating the symptoms, not the causes, of economic stagnation. Economic band-aids, like the President proposes, may temporarily help a few Americans, but they will do nothing to bring about the real long-term job growth that our country needs. And unfortunately, the President's policies are actually hurting already struggling middle-class families and making it more difficult for businesses to grow and create jobs. Now, chief among the President's failed policies is the massive boondoggle known as the Affordable Care Act. If there's one thing that you don't want in an economy where businesses are already struggling, it's legislation that places everything from new taxes to new burdensome regulations on businesses. And yet that is just exactly what Obamacare does. There's a tax on medical devices like pacemakers and prosthetics that's driving medical device jobs overseas and driving medical bills up for American patients. There's a pill tax. It's a tax on prescription drugs. A tax on businesses that do not provide a government-approved health care. A tax, multiple taxes I should say, on health insurance companies, and more. And then there are the scores of new regulations that raise the cost of doing business. Regulations like the requirement that any business with 50 or more workers provide Obamacare-approved health insurance benefits to its full-time employees, which the health care law defines as 30 hours or more per week. Now, that's all very well for some employers, but for many employers in industries with small profit margins, providing Obama-approved health care to full-time workers is the difference between making a profit and making none at all. And for employers in nonprofit fields like education, it can be the difference between staying in operation or closing. Around the country, school systems, community colleges and universities and restaurants and other small businesses are being forced to cut workers' hours to avoid the full burden of Obamacare's mandate. It's no wonder, Madam President, the health care law is so unpopular with the owners of businesses both large and small. CBS News reported in December, and I quote, that nearly half of U.S. companies said that they're reluctant to hire full-time employees because of the law, end quote. A survey from the National Association of Manufacturers found that more than 75% of manufacturers cite soaring health care costs as the biggest issue facing their businesses.
Senator's time has expired.
Madam President, I would ask for additional time, for an additional 5 minutes.
Without objection.
In addition to being bad for businesses' bottom line, Obamacare is placing a tremendous financial burden on American families. The President claimed his health care law would reduce the cost of health care, but the average family has seen a $2,500 premium increase since the law's passage. And now that the law is being fully implemented, that number is set to soar even higher. One of my constituents, Carrie, emailed me to tell me that she may have to take a part-time job to afford the health care premium she was quoted for her family of 6. That's a part-time job on top of the 2 part-time jobs she already works and the full-time job that her husband works. Another constituent, Matt from Rapid City, South Dakota, emailed to tell me that his insurance has gone up 60% since Obamacare's passage. Meanwhile, his wife's hours at work have been reduced below the Obamacare full-time threshold of 30 hours. We have had to cut back on our basic needs, he told me. Terry contacted me to tell me that his insurance policy was canceled and that he was offered a replacement policy for twice the cost of his original policy. Now, he says, 1/4 of my salary will go to my insurance. 1/4 of his salary. Is this the affordable care Americans were promised? Madam President, Democrats claim they want to grow the economy, but what do they think happens to our economy when businesses aren't growing and people aren't spending? When Americans have to devote more of their income to pay their health care bills, they cut back on other spending. They go out to fewer restaurants. They keep their old car for a few more years. They put a bucket under the leak instead of paying for a new roof. That's a lot of money not going to local businesses. Similarly, when businesses are hit with burdensome taxes and regulations, they cut back on hiring and investment. They cut workers' hours, and they move jobs overseas. And that means fewer jobs for the millions of Americans looking for work and lower wages for families already struggling to get by. If Democrats were really serious about growing the economy and creating jobs, they'd stop focusing on economic Band-Aids and start taking a long, hard look at the damage that Obamacare is doing to our economy. As members of Congress, we need to make it easier to create jobs, not harder. We should be repealing burdensome mandates, not creating them. We should be reducing the tax burden, not increasing it. And we should be creating incentives for business to expand, not eliminating them. Millions of Americans spend too much time wondering how they're going to afford their health care premiums or buy a house or send their kids to college. We need to give them the economic opportunities they need. And over the past few weeks, Republicans in the House and Senate have introduced plan after plan to get our economy moving again and to help struggling families find better jobs and increase wages. I currently introduced a plan to exempt long-term unemployed workers from the Obamacare employer mandate, which is an onerous and unpopular provision that will destroy jobs and reduce hours for hardworking Americans. In fact, this mandate is so unpopular and so unworkable that the administration unilaterally delayed it past the next election. Since even the administration doesn't want to enforce it, I think we can all agree that exempting the long-term unemployed will help break the cycle of extended unemployment that plagues the Obama economy. Madam President, we hope that Democrats will abandon their short-term cosmetic fixes and join us in talking about the kind of long-term reforms that will truly grow the economy and offer economic opportunity to every American. We've lived in the Obama economy long enough. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President. Senator from Hawaii.
Madam President, I am here to speak in opposition to the offset in IOT Amendment number 2603. The bipartisan budget that passed in December included a Republican provision that changed the annual cost of living adjustments, or COLAs, for military retirees. I oppose that provision, and I believe there is bipartisan support for repealing it. The main question that needs to be debated is how to pay for that repeal. Amendment 2603 would pay for fixing the military retiree COLA problem by denying the refundable child tax credit to millions of eligible U.S. citizen children. That amendment asks, in effect, whether military retirees are more deserving of help than U.S. citizen children who are on the edge of poverty. That is a false choice. That is not the right approach. The child tax credit is one of our most important programs to reduce child poverty. Tens of millions of families claim the child tax credit each year. More than 35 million families in 2009, both using Social Security numbers and individual taxpayer identification numbers. According to the Congressional Research Service, the child tax credit reduces child poverty by approximately 1/5. For such an important and widely used program as this, we should be careful that any changes we make to the program does not harm low-income children and working families. And many of these low-income families are headed by women. Any large program is susceptible to fraud and misuse. When fraud is alleged, the cases should be investigated and the people who commit fraud should be punished. This means targeted, aggressive auditing and enforcement, not wholesale changes to the program that will deny help to kids who are legally receiving it today. The proponents of the amendment tell us that individuals are fraudulently claiming the child tax credit for kids who live in Mexico or for kids who do not exist. That is already a violation of the law. This is fraud. I agree with the amendment sponsor that we should take steps to prevent this fraud. But the IRS says this amendment would not solve the fraud problem. In 2012, 5 senators wrote to the IRS regarding this matter, and the letter asked, quote, does the fact that a person filing the return has a Social Security number indicate whether the child claimed for the credit met the residency requirements required under the law, end quote. And the response from IRS in a letter dated July 20th, 2012 was, quote, the possession of an SSN or Social Security number by the filer is not relevant in determining whether the child met the residency requirements. In other words, imposing a Social Security number requirement does not prevent the fraud that the amendment sponsor seeks to prevent. And that makes intuitive sense. If a person is going to lie about the existence of a kid, they'll lie about the SSN too. So this amendment does not solve the problem. If this amendment doesn't solve the problem, then what would the real impact of this amendment be? Here's what the amendment would do. First, it would deny help to roughly 4 million U.S. citizen children from low-income households by making their families ineligible for the child tax credit. The average family claiming the refundable child tax credit earns only about $21,000 a year. And as I mentioned earlier, many of these families are led by women. Every dollar matters to these families. The child tax credit lifts roughly 1.5 million children out of poverty each year, and this amendment would plunge many of these children back into poverty. I want to emphasize that because of how the child tax credit is structured in the tax code, only working families are eligible for the refundable portion. These families are working and paying taxes. But in lean years, they would be denied help from the child tax credit if this amendment were to become law. They are paying taxes but would be denied help. This is not fair. Second, this amendment would render these 4 million U.S. children second-class citizen status because of who their parents are. That is contrary to the principle of equality on which this country was founded. All citizens should be treated fairly and equally. This amendment says some citizen children will receive help and others won't, depending on who their parents are. That is simply not right. In closing, there is a better way to pay for repealing the military retiree COLA provision that was included in the budget, and that is to close corporate tax loopholes. The proponents cite a news report from Indiana, which an undocumented worker admitted that he'd allow 4 other undocumented workers to use his address to file tax returns. The 4 workers did not live there, but he allowed them to use his address anyway. I agree, this is fraud and should be stopped. But this story reminds me of the story of the Ugland House in the Cayman Islands. The Ugland House is a 5-story building that has been identified as the official address for 18,857 companies, all at the same time. Some of the inhabitants of this address are some of the largest publicly traded companies in the United States. As I understand it, this is not a violation of U.S. laws. Tens of thousands of corporations can legally use the same building for their official address. It is not fraud, but merely tax planning, I'm told. Offshore mailing addresses and accounting tricks are allowing corporations to shelter enormous profits from U.S. taxes. According to Bloomberg News, 83 of the largest companies in the U.S. held $1.46 trillion in profits offshore in 2012. Another report by J.P. Morgan Chase estimates the amount of offshore profits is even higher, nearly $1.7 trillion. How does this work? One thing corporations do is funnel their revenues through shell companies to escape taxation. According to the Center for American Progress, countries like Bermuda, Ireland, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, which combined account for less than half of 1% of the world's population, generated 43% of the profits reported by American companies in 2008. Clearly, there is a major tax problem here. So while our colleagues rail against 5 workers using one address to file taxes, we hear nothing about more than 18,000 companies that have used one address to file their taxes. Talk about egregious. These corporate tax loopholes resulting in huge amount of taxes corporations don't pay are what this Congress should focus on, not on denying a few $100s of help to a U.S. citizen child who is on the edge of poverty. Senator Shaheen has filed an amendment that begins to address these corporate tax problems. Her amendment, number 2618, of which I am a co-sponsor, will prevent more than 18,000 corporations from pretending that they are headquartered in a single building in the Cayman Islands. Like Senator Ayat's amendment, the Shaheen amendment will repeal the military retiree COLA provision that was in the budget deal. The difference is Senator Shaheen's amendment would pay for the repeal by holding corporations accountable for the taxes they owe, instead of denying help to U.S. citizen children of working parents, many of whom are women, who are in poverty. We all recognize that we have a responsibility to our veterans, taxpayers, and to future generations. Senator Shaheen's amendment will allow us to meet all of these commitments at the same time. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this common sense approach and vote in favor of the Shaheen amendment and not the Ayat amendment. I yield back.
Madam President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Madam President, I want to join my colleague from Hawaii in her remarks and her opposition to the Ayat amendment. And I want to start off by simply saying that when we're talking about extending unemployment insurance benefits to Americans who have played by the rules, done everything right, through no fault of their own, find themselves unemployed, many long-term unemployed, and are trying to get a job, but still, despite an economy that is improving, hasn't seen the job market increase significantly so that they can achieve that job. What they need at this time is not a kick in the pants. They need a helping hand so that they can sustain their families during this period of time and continue to be in a position to do, which the law requires them, continue to look for a job and eventually find that job. So the reality is that this isn't a ideological battle, I hope, in a greater political war. It's about real people and real people's lives. And I don't think we can lose sight of that simple fact. Political ideology doesn't trump faith and family values. It does not trump reason or compassion or the acceptance that we're all in this together. Now, having said that, I'm encouraged that there's bipartisan support for repealing the military pension cuts. I oppose those. I'm committed to ensuring that our brave men and women and their families receive all the care and resources they deserve, both during their service and throughout their lives. They have fought for our freedom and security in the most difficult situations, and our nation owes them the same level of commitment, and we remain indebted to them for their service. But I've heard the senator from New Hampshire declare her support for offsetting the cost to fix that by fixing, quote, an egregious problem in the tax code. Now, as someone who sits on the Senate Finance Committee, I can tell you after years of being stymied by Republican opposition to closing any tax loopholes, to shutting down any abusive tax practices, I would like to have them join us in looking for savings in the tax code to achieve a bipartisan goal. But unfortunately, instead of shutting down abuses in the code, like the huge amounts of money stripped out of the United States and piling up in tax havens abroad, or instead of ending wasteful subsidies for very profitable companies such as the oil industry, or perhaps the myriad tax shelter used by millionaires to avoid paying their fair share, my colleague decided instead to propose legislation that would have a devastating impact on 4 million children who are U.S. citizens, and who deserve the every right and every protection as any other child under the Constitution, all of who are deserving of our support. Instead of working with Democrats, many who have spent a great deal of time studying and pointing out waste, fraud, and abuse in the tax code, to find a bipartisan solution, we are presented with a proposal that would go much further than she claims and hammer over 2 million working and tax-paying families. Now, what does the child tax credit do, which is the subject of her amendment? Well, the child tax credit is for people who have a qualifying child. That is the fundamental essence of the child tax credit. You are not eligible for it if you don't have a qualifying child. What is a qualifying child under the law? It must be the son, daughter, stepchild, foster child, brother, sister, stepbrother, stepsister, or a descendant of the filer. They must live with the filer for more than half of the year. And number 3, the child must be a United States citizen, a United States national, or a United States resident alien. It is the child that is the determinative factor. It is the child for which these resources ultimately we have decided as a Congress and as a society to support. We talk about being family friendly. We talk about the gap in the poverty situation in this country. We talk about the consistently growing gap in terms of the haves and the have-nots. Well, this amendment is only going to exacerbate that problem for U.S. children. For U.S. children. Now, to eliminate the ability of a taxpayer to use a taxpayer ID number in order to claim the refundable portion of the child's tax credit ignores the fact that the vast majority of these children are U.S. citizens. And the child tax credit was enacted to help families financially care for their children. And the refundable portion was introduced because children in working families deserve the same support provided by benefits in the tax code as anyone else. And that's why we made it refundable, because we wanted to reward work and we wanted to help with the growth of that child and to deal with their challenges. Now, I agree with the senator from New Hampshire that the anecdotal stories that she included in her remarks amount to fraud, and they should be stopped. But let's be clear. The stories that she told of claiming credits for children not in the United States or of 1,000 tax returns linked to 8 addresses, those actions are already illegal by whoever would make such a false filing, whoever would commit those actions. Now, in fact, what the senator does is cite reports of IRS investigators who did their job shutting down illegal activity. It seems to me that the IRS doesn't need her amendment to go after this fraud. They need the resources and the investigators to ultimately make sure that all elements of the code that have fraudulent activity being taken need to be dealt with. They need Republicans to stop cutting their funds so they can do their job better. But to use these instances of fraud that were successfully pursued to go after American children, that's not confronting fraud. It's disadvantaging children, 4 million children to be exact. You know, if we had one computer science company prosecuted for tax evasion, we don't bar all computer science companies from ever taking the research and development tax credit again. If we find one entity, one person, one industry committing a fraud, we don't eliminate all of the benefits of that code, the provision of the tax code for which they committed fraud, because we have decided that that provision is of a societal benefit. What we do is make sure we go after the individuals who commit the fraud. So it doesn't make any sense. Just like hammering 4 million U.S. children because of fraud perpetrated by some other unscrupulous actor doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I believe this amendment creates a clear-cut case of priorities. Surely nobody here would argue that outside of this instance, there is no other part of the tax code that allows waste, fraud, or abuse. We could sit down and find dozens of wasteful loopholes, fraudulent tax practices, and abusive tax shelters that could be shut down in order to pay for restoring the cuts to military pensions. If my Republican colleagues chose to support these efforts, I think this bill would sail through the Senate. So I say to my friends who are putting up obstacles, because I believe that a lot of these false choices that are being put out there are not for the purposes of a legitimate public policy goal, but really to undermine the efforts of achieving the extension of unemployment insurance. I say to them, I think you need to stop and think. Think about the people who are hurting. Think about their lives, their hopes, their struggles. Think about what their conversations are around the kitchen table at night. Every night in New Jersey and all over the country, thousands of families who have played by the rules and are looking for work, are sitting around the table asking heart-wrenching questions. How will we afford the mortgage and keep our home if we cannot get the assistance during this period of time? What do I have to decide between putting food on the table and keeping a place for my family? What if I have a health emergency? These are real-life conversations that are being had by Americans across this country. How are we not putting aside ideology and looking into our conscience for the obvious answer? A simple extension of unemployment benefits for those who need our help. It's a no-brainer at a time when so many need help now and don't care about politics, who don't want or deserve to be pawns in a political battle over the role or size of government. They just want help from the very people who represent them. It isn't a time for political games. It's a time for action. We can always argue deficits, we can argue debt management, we can argue politics, but for now, it's about the American people, their lives, their hopes, their dreams for a better life for themselves and their families. And it's about the kind of nation we are and the values we hold dear. Madam President, extending unemployment benefits isn't just the right thing to do morally, it also makes good economic sense. Study after study has shown that unemployment benefits are one of the most effective ways to help our economy grow, so much so that every dollar spent produces a benefit of at least $1.50 in gross domestic product. And that's because people receiving benefits spend the money, immediately stimulating the economy in the form of consumer spending, which accounts for 70% of our GDP. leaving 1.3 million Americans in the cold without any assistance would end up costing our economy 240,000 jobs. Now, some on the other side say helping people who've been out of work is a crutch. I have to be honest with you, I have never met a person in my state who said they wanted to be on unemployment, who found dignity in being on unemployment, who found realizing their dreams by being on unemployment. They found their dignity by achieving a job that helped them realize their hopes and dreams and aspirations. The American worker is not lazy, and they don't want handouts. With the job market still recovering, there simply aren't enough jobs available for them. And as we work to make that happen, to make sure that there is an economy that has enough jobs for Americans to be able to realize their hopes and dreams and aspirations, it's incumbent on us to make sure that we continue to assist them so that those stark choices around the kitchen table aren't as horrible as they are today. I hope that my colleagues will oppose hurting 4 million American children, hurting and exacerbating the poverty in our country, sending a message that goes counter to what the child tax credit was all about, that we want to help an American child be able to fulfill their hopes and dreams and aspirations and their God-given potential. The adoption of the Ayotte Amendment would go entirely counter to that belief. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.
Once again, the Senate will be in recess until 2:15 for their weekly party lunches. We do have cameras on Capitol Hill to get remarks as party leaders head back to the chamber this afternoon for more debate on unemployment benefits. Again, watch live coverage of the Senate here on C-SPAN 2 when they return at 2:15 Eastern. On our Facebook page, we have posted a question asking you, how long is too long for unemployment benefits?